this episode of Freedom Hub's Working Group. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Froman. We're sponsored by the Freedom Hub, which is the Disruptors Intersection, and we'll take a quick gander over there. It's at your-mp.com. And when you do get over there, you'll see the home tab, you'll see webinars, which is where we're today, and the important one, which is continuing the conversation, because that's your opportunity to connect with the speaker after today's event is over. So you're going to want to help get engaged with them, and they definitely go back for years with some fantastic topics. When you click on the webinar site, though, you'll see a little intro about what we're doing here, and then as you scroll down, you'll come into the first webinar of the day, which is this one here. So at that point, I'm going to let Charles take over.
Gladly, Jeff, and welcome back, Kerry. We had Kerry a couple of years ago join Michael Ramey from Parental Rights, defending independent thinking families from abusive harassment from Child Protective Service and the family law courts. If you homeschool or make certain health decisions that maybe the majority doesn't, sometimes that can attract the wrong kind of attention. And, on that topic, before we go to today's topic, I was very pleased to see Parental Rights e-blast today announcing that the conservative state politicians org, ALEC, just endorsed a bill forbidding any more anonymous snitching on questionable family practices. Anyone that wants to ruin the lives of a family now have to leave their name and contact information so that you can't ruin a family just because you don't like them or their politics. And that could become a huge issue as the government squeezes its talons on those that don't want to participate in the mainstream recommendations for healthy behavior, even if they're experiments. So Kerry has been a senior scholar at the Foundation for Economic Education for many years. He's an adjunct at the Gatto Institute, where I used to work a couple of decades ago. And today she's going to continue from last time on her education angle, this time around COVID. And what got me to invite her again was this really cool article with the nifty title, Locke or Lockdowns. Locke as in John Locke, which every free-thinking person knows is the philosopher behind Jefferson's Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness in our Independence Declaration. Locke was a bit more explicit about property. But what a lot of folks don't know about Locke was he was a pretty wide-ranging philosopher. He wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and he spoke a lot about education reform, even before a lot of us who got into the education market. And of course, I left lobbying in the mid-2000s to get my master's and teach in DC's inner city. And I knew all about John Taylor Gatto and A.S. Neill and democratic schooling and all that good, cool stuff. I didn't know John Locke talked about gentle parenting back in the, 1700s or 1600s? When was he a philosopher? We'll get reminded by Kerry. But it's not just about school choice. Liberty folks are pretty good on vouchers and education tax credits. What most education reformers don't know much about is the next step. What the Arrow folks are really good at, the Alternative Education Resource Organization, and that's student-led learning, which gets into Montessori, democratic schooling, the idea that kids do have an interest and they will follow it. John Taylor Gatto was good on recognizing that fact. And you don't need this K through 12 homework, top-down testing, fanatic type of schooling to produce good adults. And the craziness in the schools with masking or these weird ways of teaching have really spurred a lot of parents to make the jump, to try homeschooling, private schooling. And so that's why, it's lock or lockdowns, not just about freedom or lockdowns. It's about, helping your kids get a better education experience. You don't have to stay trapped in the government schools. So that's the intro, Jeff.
Fantastic. Well, it doesn't get much more basic than that there, does it, Kerry? It's the foundation of everything we've got going on. It's the education we all start with. Right. So please lead us on.
Well, it's great to be with you, Charles and Jeff. Thanks for the invitation. Good to be back for the Freedom Hub webinar. And yeah, I thought I would spend some time talking a little bit about my work at the Foundation for Economic Education over the past 18 months, sort of from the beginning of the coronavirus response and the government lockdowns, and then how that's really sort of catalyzed this parental empowerment moment, so that the tighter the government constricts liberty, we're seeing increasingly more decentralization and more freedom, more kind of home-based, community-based solutions that go beyond the government. So in some ways, an unintended consequence of lockdowns is that there is more of this kind of parent and family empowerment and more decentralized solutions in education and healthcare and other sectors as well. And I'll get into that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and tell me if you can see this okay. Let's see.
Very good.
Let me do. How's that looking?
Excellent.
Great. So let's start at the beginning, right? In the spring of 2020, I had written an article in my Forbes column called The World's Homeschooling Moment, when of course there were these massive school closures, 50 million US K-12 students displaced suddenly from their classrooms. At the peak of the global lockdowns in the spring of 2020, we had 1.5 billion students worldwide that were, suddenly learning at home. And of course, those of us who've been homeschooling would be quick to tell you this isn't, or that wasn't the real thing. This was sort of pandemic homeschooling or crisis homeschooling, really school at home connected to that district or that school, but still kind of gave parents a little bit of a taste of living and learning alongside their kids, albeit in a really difficult situation and certainly so much uncertainty and unpredictability. But I think one of the first indicators for me in the spring of 2020 that this was going to be a profound moment of education transformation came in April of 2020 when EdChoice put out a survey asking parents a variety of different questions about how the COVID response and school closures were impacting their lives and their outlook. And in that initial survey, which they then repeated monthly and continue to. But in that initial one in April 2020, more than half of the parents surveyed said that they had a more favorable view toward homeschooling than they did prior to the government's response to COVID. And I thought, gosh, if parents think this type of learning at home and crisis homeschooling is not too bad, then just imagine when they encounter the real thing, when they're actually able to be immersed in the people, places, and things in their community and have a much more authentic homeschooling experience. So that was sort of my first inkling that homeschooling and other schooling alternatives would be catalyzed through the government's response to the coronavirus. Another piece of it too was that, of course, parents were getting, in some cases for the first time, this close-up view of what was actually happening in their children's classrooms through district Zoom schooling. And some of them were really horrified by what they were seeing, that they were perhaps seeing this sort of watered down curriculum. I know I spoke to one family early in the original school closure days in the spring of 2020 that said, gosh, my kid is reading, the teacher's reading a book to the class that my child read to herself 2 years ago. So sort of seeing that the academic expectations in the classroom wasn't really meeting the expectations of parents. There was a close-up view, I think, in many cases of some of the ideology that might have been happening in classrooms, some of the ways in which teachers interacted with or spoke to the students that many parents found unappealing. And so all of that together, started leading parents to think, let's see. Yeah, to think a little bit differently about how their children might learn come fall of 2020. when back to school last year looked quite uncertain, and it wasn't clear what it was going to be like. So in summer 2020, homeschooling registrations really soared. In fact, the first week of July of 2020, so many parents in North Carolina signed up to register their kids as homeschoolers the first week that they were able to as part of the system, that it crashed the state's education website. So already we're again starting to see data kind of pouring in these pockets suggesting that homeschooling was going to be big, and that began to bear itself out. You know, there was Gallup polling later in the summer of 2020 suggesting that the homeschool rate would double to about 10% of K-12 students in the U.S. That would have been a huge increase. We also saw last year the rise of what were known as pandemic pods, which were these small, home-based, often multi-age learning communities that were really sort of a modern twist on timely homeschool co-ops that had been around for quite some time, but kind of brought together this homeschool co-op model as well as the emerging microschool model that had been gaining traction prior to the pandemic. And parents realized that they could gather with other families and have their children learn in sort of small, safe social environments, typically in a family's home, and alternating homes or picking one location, and either have parents take turns facilitating the learning, or in many cases hire a teacher or a facilitator to lead those pandemic pods. And so that was also really exciting, and I think something that was showing the power of sort of decentralized, spontaneous, parent-driven solutions to, again, the government's response, and particularly ongoing school closures. And once parents realized, gosh, I can make this work. My kid doesn't have to go to school in order to learn. In fact, maybe we can create some of these alternatives that are better. I think that led more families to be open to other education methods and approaches. And of course, the teachers unions helped out there, right? Because they were the ones last summer that were instrumental in halting school reopenings. And I think families realized, gosh, I don't want my kids heading back into these classrooms when, back into Zoom school when that was a disaster in many cases in the spring. And I'd rather, pick some other approach for the fall of 2020. And that's exactly what happened. So there was this exodus from district schools last fall. Public kindergarten enrollment was down an astonishing 16% nationwide. This was in large part families delaying early school entry, or just continuing with maybe a private preschool program or enrolling their child in a private preschool program. Overall, K-12 public school enrollment nationwide last year was down 3%. In some areas, it was down much more. I think of, for example, Los Angeles public schools were down nearly 5% in the last academic year. And where were these kids going? Well, they were choosing homeschooling, or they were heading into private schools that were more likely to reopen last fall for full-time in-person learning than district schools, again, largely due to teacher union influence. And in fact, last fall, one of the first studies came out showing the real impact of teacher union influence on school reopening decisions. These were Brown University researchers that discovered that it wasn't virus rates or sort of concerns about viral spread in a community that led to whether or not a school district reopened for full-time in-person learning. It was all about politics and the strength and influence of that teachers union. In fact, the Brown researchers also discovered that in counties that had a high rate of parochial schools, Catholic schools, that were more likely to reopen for full-time in-person learning, public schools were also in those counties more likely to open for full-time in-person learning because of the competition with these other private schools. So really, really interesting. And of course, we start to see data come out about the real harm that social isolation was having on children. And I think parents were really starting to see this as well and say, I have to take my children's well-being into my own hands. I can't leave it up to these school administrators or district officials or government bureaucrats or politicians, that it's up to me to make sure that my children, that their mental health is being preserved, that they are having some social interaction with kids. And again, that certainly school closures were a part of that, but the larger piece was that kids were separated from their overall communities, regardless of whether or not schools reopened. So really up to parents, and it's kind of the point I was making there, is up to parents to make sure these kids have that social interaction, and that it's up to parents to preserve their kids' well-being. So we move into the winter of 2020, and sort of see what's happening here. Well, district Zoom schooling was certainly a disaster. More evidence came out suggesting that failure rates were quite high in the fall of 2020, that kids were just not learning through Zoom school. And I feel like this was one of the tragedies of the 2020 academic year, was that it may have turned off a lot of families to virtual learning, and maybe put a stigma on virtual learning and online learning platforms, which is really a shame, because even though district Zoom schooling really was a disaster for many kids, online learning and virtual learning platforms can be incredibly effective and extremely high quality, because in many cases, these platforms were designed to be online learning approaches, that they have, they were intended to be remote. They have educators who are eager to learn, eager to teach remotely and know how to do it. And the curriculum is designed for a remote audience. And so that was, I think, a real shame. So I really wanted to point out to families that some of these schooling alternatives that they may have been starting to consider during this kind of ongoing school closures and these pandemic policies related to education, that virtual schooling was a really positive schooling alternative. They just wanted to get away from the government model and move towards these private online learning providers. I think, for example, of providers like ASU Prep Digital, Arizona State University Prep Digital, which is designed to be an online learning program. They now run K-12 programs, but started off just as high school, where it's kind of dual enrollment, high school credit, and concurrent Arizona State University college credits, so that students can begin to accumulate college credits and then transfer those credits to a four-year university and save quite a bit of money when they ultimately enroll in higher education. That is an extremely high quality learning platform that is entirely virtual, but is doing really great things. So I just wanted to, kind of point out to families that as they're thinking about schooling alternatives, don't take a pass on virtual learning, that there really are some tremendous providers there. And of course, teachers unions were continuing last winter to block reopening plans. It came out, some of you may know, in late winter, early spring, that the teachers unions were sort of in cahoots with the CDC. They were influencing CDC policy on school reopening plans. That continued, including the teachers unions influencing mask policies in schools, to the point where some of the CDC language was taken verbatim from emails that were exchanged with teacher union representatives. So, I think, again, parents were starting to really see that they maybe shouldn't be putting so much trust in government bureaucrats and in politicians and some of these government agencies, that really it was up to them to take the lead in choosing the best education setting and environment for their kids. And so last winter, I think it was February, EdChoice came out with another survey. Remember, I said that they were periodically surveying parents from the spring of 2020 onward. Well, in February, parents had an even more favorable view of homeschooling, now up to 63% of parents who were saying that they, again, were more favorable towards homeschooling than they were pre-pandemic. And, I think another thing that was happening in the winter of 2021 is many school districts were still closed. The majority of kids across the country were still doing remote schooling. They were not in a classroom as late as April of 2021. more and more families, I think, were beginning to realize that what was happening here in the US and around the world was really the antithesis of kind of classical liberal values. And this is where I started to introduce in my writing the ideas of John Locke, which I think is what, Charles and Jeff latched onto for this session today. But one of my favorite quotes from John Locke, which I think really encapsulates kind of this classical liberal view, is it is one thing to persuade, another to command, one thing to press with arguments, another with penalties. So it is one thing to persuade, another thing to command, one thing to press with arguments, another with penalties. And of course, we were moving really a lot more towards penalties and towards commands. And I think a lot of parents were starting to see that that was really illiberal. It was really a threat to sort of these values on which our country is founded and on which freedom flourishes. And so I made the point that really it was an opportunity for parents to talk about these ideas with their kids and hopefully let them know that none of this is normal, none of this is right. This government overreach in response to the coronavirus was outrageous, continues to be outrageous, and that it's up to parents to teach that next generation that this isn't okay, that we need to go back to classical liberal values of persuasion over coercion. And that make sure that parents let their kids know that this can never happen again, that really it is up to parents to do that. So teaching liberty. So what happens in the spring of 2021 is, more data comes out showing just how widespread the exodus from K-12 government schools in the US was. And the US Census Bureau in March reported that homeschooling had tripled from pre-pandemic rates. So what they found was that homeschooling doubled from the spring of 2020 to the fall of 2020, from 5% to over 11%, so more than doubled in just that period of time. And that would be a tripling from pre-pandemic levels if we look at federal data going back to 2016, where around 3% of overall US K-12 student population was homeschooling. So now over 11%, according to the US Census Bureau, of K-12 students here are being homeschooled. And one of the really interesting facts or data points that the Census Bureau discovered was that there was a 5-fold increase in the number of Black homeschoolers during the 2020 academic year. And so that now actually there are more Black homeschoolers are overrepresented in the homeschooling community compared to the representation in the overall K-12 public school population. So now more than 16% of US homeschoolers are Black homeschoolers, and that compares to about 15% of Black students in the overall US K-12 population. So I think that's interesting. Also interesting was that Education Week had done similar surveys in last academic year, finding a similarly large increase in homeschooling, and they found that low-income families were one of the biggest drivers of that homeschooling surge, and which makes sense, right? You have a lot of families in urban areas, potentially low income, schools are shuttered, they realize their kids are not getting the education that they need, that they deserve. Maybe they can't afford private schools, or maybe there aren't private schools available to them conveniently, and so they're pulling their kids for independent homeschooling. What we also found, again, starting in the spring of 2021, was sort of some inklings about what was going to happen the fall of 2021, what we're in now, and started to see beginning last March, April timeframe, kindergarten applications for the fall of 2021 right now were beginning to plummet. New York City applications were down 12%. Other major cities also seeing applications plummeting. And you also saw some of the sort of interplay between divisive policies or the emphasis on critical race theory in classrooms really turning off a lot of parents. And of course, parents now awaken to the idea that there are other ways that their kids could be learning, that they don't necessarily need to put up with what their district is handing them, that they have more options than they may have thought. And so these divisive policies, sort of turned them off. I think of, for example, there was a school in Palm Beach County, Florida, that lost 10% of its public school students in last academic year, 2020-2021. And many of those parents were thinking of sending their kids back to school this year because the district was going to allow parents not to have their kids wear masks. And that was a big driver of why parents pulled their kids in this particular school out last year, was that they had mandatory masking. And so parents were ready to send the kids back this fall. And then an equity statement got sent around the district and the county, and turned off a lot of parents. This kind of focus on racial and identity politics that turned off some families. And so they decided to continue homeschooling. So there was that happening as well. We kind of had the cultural aspect as along with the fact that parents felt more empowered, and then ongoing coronavirus policies that, sort of led families to think of other options. And we saw more of that happening in the summer of 2021. This is when I released my free ebook through FEE called the 2021 Curious Parents Guide to Education Options, where I kind of went over a lot of the things I'm talking about here today, but also provided, some of these examples of what alternatives families have, not just independent homeschooling, but other things like these microschool communities and learning pods or pandemic pods, high quality virtual learning, and, sort of ways to create your own education model or, new education entrepreneurship. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So what happened in the summer 2021? It's interesting, if you had told me that or asked me back in saying kind of late spring, early summer, what I would have thought in terms of the homeschooling numbers for this fall, I would have said, well, homeschooling will certainly remain elevated. Whether it remains over 11% of the overall student population, probably not. That there would be, likely a significant dip, but it would still maintain higher numbers than it would have pre-pandemic. Well, as the summer wore on, that just wasn't the case. I mean, you just started to see a lot of this kind of antagonism in school districts around masking, around COVID protocols that were angering a lot of families. And I think a lot of parents just said, we are not going to put our kids through this. So we had parents pulling their kids out of school due to various mask policies. And that was on both sides of the aisle, right? You had some parents that were frustrated that their schools had a mask mandate, and so they pulled their kids out for homeschooling or private school options. And you had other families that were upset because there wasn't a mask mandate, and they pulled their kids out for homeschooling or other private education options. As a lot of schools down in the South began to reopen in early August for in-person learning, it became very clear very quickly within the first week of school in many cases that some of these COVID protocols were going to be extremely disruptive to learning this year. You had entire grades, as entire classrooms in 2-week quarantines, a few days into the academic year because of possible virus exposure. And I think a lot of families were again saying, we don't want to put our kids through this. This isn't going to be a healthy or a positive learning experience for them this year. Let's find some other options. And as all of this was kind of going on, general taxpayer support for school choice policies has reached record levels. So we now have, I think, the latest data from Real Clear Opinion Research surveys show that something like 73% of taxpayers now support funding following students as opposed to funding bureaucratic school systems. And as a result, there were headlines suggesting that the previous academic year, 2020-2021, was the year for school choice. You had active school choice legislation occurring in more than 24 states, either introducing or expanding existing school choice policies, including education savings accounts, tax credit scholarship programs, vouchers, and so on, that really enabled some of that taxpayer funding to go to students as opposed to these schools that were just simply not responsive to family needs. And as a result, parents were really, open to new options and seeing, what else would be available for their kids come fall of 2021. And as more and more coercion gets added to the picture, more and more families exit. So this is sort of where I'm getting to this idea of, the more that the government kind of cracked down on mandates, the more families withdrew and decided that they wanted to pursue other options. So it was sort of this tug of war between coercion and freedom. But on the side of freedom, families really open to new education options and creating new education options, particularly education entrepreneurs who really were instrumental and have been instrumental in building new learning approaches. So one of the things we discovered in Los Angeles, they became the first major school district to mandate the COVID-19 vaccine for all children. All children eligible for the vaccine would have to be vaccinated by the end of the calendar year. If they participated in sports or extracurricular activities, they had to be fully vaccinated by the end of October. And California is one of the few states that does not have religious exemptions, philosophical exemptions. They got rid of those a few years ago. So families were tied. I mentioned earlier that last year, Los Angeles lost nearly 5% of its student body due to some of their policies and shuttered schools. And it looks like, again, that these vaccine mandates will continue to contribute to an exodus. In fact, some of the school leaders and officials in Los Angeles public schools, when interviewed and asked about this mandate potentially triggering parents leaving, they said, yeah, they may leave, but we're going to go through with this anyway. So I think it's another moment of really parents taking back control of their children's education and finding some other alternatives. And we see that happening, that homeschooling numbers are continuing to rise. In fact, Texas, which had record numbers of homeschoolers last year, they reported one of their top homeschool advocacy groups noted that they have had 3 times the rate of emails and phone calls this past summer than they did in the summer of 2020 of families interested in homeschooling and wondering how to get started, how to pull their kids out. And last summer was already record highs. So now they're 3 times their previous record highs in terms of inquiries from families wondering how they can get started homeschooling. Similar trend in Virginia and other states as well, as parents really are seeing what's happening in these schools. They're seeing, here in Massachusetts, I wrote about how so many school bus drivers have been quitting across the country. There's a trend nationwide, in large part due to vaccine mandates. COVID vaccine mandates is an article in Chicago in particular that Chicago announced a COVID vaccine mandate for all school bus drivers, everyone affiliated with the district, and so many school bus drivers quit that there's now this massive shortage. And here in Massachusetts, where I am now, we have National Guard troops called in to drive the school buses. So I think a lot of parents are saying, gosh, I don't want my kids in this kind of environment. Let's look at some other options. And here, are the other options. So education entrepreneurship has really skyrocketed. It's one of the real bright points, I think, over the past 18 months. My most recent Forbes article about back to school alternatives highlights some of these education entrepreneurs. I think of, for example, a startup called KaiPod Learning, which is Boston-based startup participating right now in the prestigious Y Combinator Startup Accelerator program out in Silicon Valley. So set up for some significant venture capital money. They offer an opportunity for families to have their kids get together in physical spaces, multi-age communities, choosing their own online learning provider from a whole suite of the possible virtual learning providers. And there are adult facilitators there to help, as well as offer enrichment activities and social opportunities. So they're doing some great things. I've written about another company called GetSchoolhouse.com, which really tapped into this momentum for pandemic pods. So what they'll do is help families connect with each other to form these small home-based learning communities or micro schools, and then they'll connect those families with a certified teacher to be the pod teacher. They just raised more than $8 million in venture capital funding this past April. So they're doing some great things as well. And there's also some really, cool things happening kind of regionally with education entrepreneurship. So I think that that's a huge moment. We have a lot of interest from investors in tapping into the schooling alternative market, using homeschooling as a catalyst to innovate and experiment with different education models. And I think that that's just such an exciting development and really speaks to the overall movement, I think, towards these decentralized solutions in both education and healthcare. My most recent FEE article this year talked about how extreme hospital COVID policies are leading more women to choose a home birth. And as someone who had 2 of my 4 babies at home, I was excited to see that trend as well, of sort of families opting out of institutional care in both education and healthcare for, these incredibly powerful, safe, delightful experiences around home birthing or homeschooling or other kinds of out of hospital or out of school learning experiences and care experiences. So that has been great. So I'm really overall, I think I'm feeling like the focus on coercion is having an opposite effect in a lot of ways by expanding freedom and triggering some real exciting innovation, experimentation, and family empowerment. So, I'll just sort of end on a few kind of final thoughts here, which is that, first, I feel like education will never be the same. We really are in this incredibly disruptive moment where in a lot of sectors, but education primarily, mainly because parents have been put back in charge of their children's education in ways unimaginable pre-pandemic. They not only got a close-up look at what was happening in their kids' schools, and they didn't like a lot of what they saw, but they now realize they have more options, and it's up to them to decide what the best education environment is for their kids. I think a lot of families are moving away from this idea of education assignments towards education choices. And maybe they've kind of been awakened from their stupor, where they realize that in so many other aspects of their lives, they have so many choices, so many options, but in education, they don't. That for the most part, education is about government assignments. You are assigned to a local district school, and that's pretty much your only option for most families. And I think a lot of families are just saying, we're not going to settle for that anymore. We've realized now that it's up to us to really decide what the best education setting, environment, experience is for our kids. And as a result, the government school monopoly is weakening. There's more of this education, innovation, and entrepreneurship that is providing the catalyst for this disruptive innovation in education. We saw this pre-pandemic. It is accelerating now. More of these decentralized solutions. I think school choice legislation is helping with that. It's helping put families back in charge. It's helping parents have more ability to opt out. And I think that just in general, we're going to see a lot of sort of positive results in education and other sectors as these entrenched institutions get forever disrupted. And so I will leave us there and open it up for a conversation.
Fantastic. I'll tell you, that was great. What an encouraging, exciting time for all of this, because I've been keeping an eye on this myself like you for years, and suddenly it's like, all right, the time has come. Took something bad to happen, which is oftentimes the case, but that's great. Here, a quickie question, and then a little longer question. They have those National Guard driving those buses. What were the National Guard supposed to be doing that are suddenly now driving buses? And also those other people not deprived of employment.
Right, I know, right? So they called up think there's over 200 people in Massachusetts, 200 National Guards troops that have been called up to participate with the overall effort. And it's about 90 soldiers that will be actively driving these school buses, mostly in some urban areas around the eastern part of the state.
And then what's interesting is that the National Guard are not like full-time soldiers. They have regular day jobs and stuff. They're being pulled off their regular job to come do this. Silly. Here's the other question. You think there'll be a little spillover as far as like with the unions, like you talked about, which is fine to see that this has happened. Everybody's figured out that the union's kind of a bogus situation. You think this is going to spill into other businesses and industries where unions also have a similar hidden agenda and stranglehold?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's been interesting to see the different ways different unions across the country have responded to various vaccine mandates. I think it will really depend on the union, but I do think that the more that the teachers' unions don't, show that they're not really interested in children and in families, that they really are kind of a typical public sector union that's all about maximizing compensation and benefits for their workers, the more parents are turned off by that, and especially seeing how influential the teachers union is at the national level and influencing CDC policy as well as the local and state levels. I think that leaves a bad taste in a lot of parents' mouths and maybe helps them to think about some alternatives.
I would think so in that regard, because it is so strong the way they've been, as opposed to like, lukewarm when it made everybody so outraged. Brittany, I see your hands up.
Okay. Hi, Kerry.
Hi, Brittany. How are you?
Hi. Good. I totally agree that this is such a revolutionary time, and it's so sorry. There's my cat. And this is such an opportunity for us to be creating new things. And as you know, we just started a private membership association education venture, and we're starting with online stuff. I'm wondering, what advice do you have for people coming into what's really a new world? It's not just that people are looking for the same thing they were getting from the schools. It's like the way people are thinking of education is changing. And so what are there any trends that you see, or any insights you have as far as what families are wanting, and what advice would you give to those of us who are starting ventures in this new world?
That's such a good question. I think one of the reasons why I think we're never going to go back to kind of education as normal, and why I feel like this is such a transformative moment, is because I'm not sure we're going to go back to work as normal. I think that, for example, there's a lot more acceptance of remote work. There's a lot more demand for workplace flexibility. That, of course, was also happening pre-pandemic, but I think a lot of employers are realizing they can get a lot of productivity from their workers when their workers work from home, either full-time or most of the time, in sort of these hybrid schedules. And a lot of employees like having the flexibility of working from home. And I think as that takes off, then a lot of parents are saying, gosh, if I'm not tied to a building 5 days a week, 9 to 5, why should I expect my child to be confined to that same kind of 5 day a week set schedule and routine? And so as parents have more freedom and flexibility in their own work lives, in many cases, they want to grant that freedom and flexibility to their children as well. And that's where education entrepreneurship and some of the initiatives like what you're launching are so critical, because they come in to scoop up and fill that gap. And families now realize they have more choices. So I think that's the key, is providing as many options to families as possible that make facilitating this transition from an institution to an alternative setting, like a home-based setting or community commercial space, something like that, more doable, more flexible, more reflective of our modern lives, where again, we have so many choices, we have so much personalization in all other areas of our lives, and yet somehow education is this kind of cookie cutter experience for the vast majority of US school children. And more parents say, no, that's crazy. I want the same level of individualization, personalization, freedom and flexibility for my child's education that I have in every other part of my life.
Excellent. Dr. Campbell?
Hey, Kerry, Bob Campbell, Pennsylvania. Wonderful presentation. I wish I had heard this about a year and a half ago. I think I experienced what probably a lot of people experienced during COVID. It was a very chaotic time, and we made the choice to homeschool my 15-year-old son. And, in Pennsylvania, you're able to take the money to follow the student, but the school, of course, really wanted you to use their cyber program so that they could get that money.
Sure.
And it just ended up just not working out so well. So I wonder what kind of resources moving forward. Clearly things are different now and it's not as chaotic. So we have the time to make good decisions. So I wonder if in your ebook, if you have resources or what kind of resources can a parent tap into when they know nothing about it and don't want to be hoodwinked by the local school district?
Yeah, I mean, I think the more parents can opt out of their government school system, the better. They have more flexibility, more options there. And a lot of these options are lower cost. I mentioned, for example, Pod Learning, that startup here in Boston that's offering this kind of physical space for kids to come together with whatever virtual learning curriculum they have. It's up to them, or they can get advice from the founders as well. And they can get parents, and this is in, kind of greater Boston, really kind of high rent area. Parents can get up to 50 hours a week of care for their children in this learning space with these adult facilitators, social interaction, enrichment activities, and so on, for about $400 a week, which is, not cheap by any means, but relatively speaking, compared to other private education options for the quantity of care that they're getting, certainly competitive. And they're hoping to scale and get that down. They also have a lot of tuition reimbursement programs and financial aid and so on. I mentioned earlier Arizona State University Prep Digital. So that, again, is one of the sort of nation's, I think, highest quality virtual learning providers. They are tuition free for Arizona residents. Arizona has one of the best education choice policies of any state in the country. Florida's right up there as well, but has lots of options for families. And so this is through a charter school network. So it's tuition free if you're an Arizona resident. If you're out of state as a full-time high school dual enrollment student, it's under $7,000 a year. Again, not feasible for everyone, although there are some tuition options and opportunities to get some financial aid there. But if we think about, in that case, you're getting college credits included with that $7,000 price tag. So when you get out of your high school diploma program, you could have 2 years of college credits under your belt, transfer into a 4-year university, and really be saving quite a bit of money. So, there are these affordable options, and I'd encourage a lot of parents to look beyond kind of district school or these kind of state-run virtual programs or other alternative programs, and really look at more private options that can be both affordable and high quality.
Well, I indicated, in Pennsylvania, you get like about $12,000 goes with you. So you get to take your portion, if you will, of the property tax and get to divert it to whatever school you choose. So that's a big advantage, but most parents are just overwhelmed. Don't know where to start.
Yeah, I'd say start with my ebook,
Yeah.
the 2021 Curious Parents Guide to Education Options. I'll put the link in the chat here. But it's a free ebook that goes through a variety of different options available to families beyond just independent homeschooling. I think there's never been a moment, certainly in recent history, where families have so many more choices.
Thank you.
Kerry, are you seeing a lot of other outside people who are like past child age, but wish they'd have had this, or always were kind of big choice advocates jumping on board too?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this acknowledgement that this is really a profound moment in education. And I mean, just the sheer numbers, if we think about now over 5 million US K-12 students choosing independent homeschooling, again, they've severed ties with their district and chose to, educate their children themselves, typically with the help of these other kinds of providers and resources in their communities. Just the numbers are just so staggering that I think it's very clear that this is a big moment for expansion of education options for families in all kinds of ways.
Excellent. We need that forever change. So that's great. Charles, I got your hand up there.
Yeah, so as I said in my intro, free market folks are pretty good on school choice, vouchers, education tax credits, but fewer of them understand not just homeschooling, but student-led learning. What John Taylor Gatto termed guerrilla curriculum. Excuse me. What do you think about, reforms that help student-led learning? Sorry.
Yeah, so in the article that that you noted about when I was talking about Locke and lockdowns, it was actually came from my weekly email newsletter through Fee. So if you visit me at fee.org/Kerry, you can sign up. Have the sign up link to my weekly free email newsletter. And I wrote about how I was thinking a lot more about John Locke lately. So I write quite a bit about John Locke in my 2019 book, Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, that has really seen a lot of increased interest in sales over the last 18 months, as so many families have been wondering about homeschooling or have decided to made the decision to homeschool their kids. So they've been turning to that book. And of course, I mentioned John Locke's statement earlier about persuasion over coercion and so on. And in my Unschooled book, I trace kind of the origins of self-directed education and the unschooling philosophy, kind of non-coercive learning, to these Enlightenment values of self-determination and self-actualization, and the writings of John Locke, in particular his 1693 treatise, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, where he did talk a lot about what we would think of today as sort of these gentle parenting or non-coercive learning techniques. He talks about how kids will learn a lot more when they go towards a concept or content willingly than when they're dragged to it unwillingly. And it's just really revolutionary when we think about him writing this in the late 17th century, and just so resonant now as parents really think about all of the coercion that's happening, not only in kind of the larger society with government policies, but the inherent coercion associated with government schooling, and now realize that they can move away from that coercion and have more freedom by taking back control.
That's great. Though it's kind
Sorry,
of
Jeff, real quick, if you don't mind.
please. Sure.
I was joking myself, asking the question. I'm better now. So yeah, the theory is great. It works great. How has that penetrated the market? There's Montessori, there's Summerhill, there's Arrow, the organization for student-led learning. Is it still a minuscule piece of the market? Is it still a bridge too far for most parents? Or, is there hope that this, upgrade in the kids' experience, so it's not just a private version of K through 12 homework, testing, etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there has been an uptick. I think a lot of it goes back to this idea of really looking at education in the same way we look at other parts of our lives, and wanting and demanding more choice, more personalization, more competition. And so with that, we see more of these non-coercive practices. I go back to this startup KaiPod Learning or GetSchoolhouse.com that are venture capital backed, that really provide a lot of that kind of student-directed learning philosophy and family-centered learning without coercion. In my Forbes article earlier this month, where I talk about some of these back-to-school alternatives, I also mentioned Guidepost Montessori, which has seen tremendous growth over the past 18 months, particularly in their online learning programs and in their hybrid programs, where they will connect families who want kind of a micro school Montessori learning pod with a Montessori trained educator. They're seeing tremendous growth there. So I think that's another hopeful sign that we're moving more towards freedom and away from force in education.
The uptick of all that for sure is, look at all the innovation that's going to start to explode once we get away with that top-down model. That's exciting. Well, I got to tell you, this was a very exciting day. We've definitely learned a lot, and we're all excited to see where things are going to go. So we're going to have to catch up again and see where things are leading now that we look back at this a year from today. So thanks for being here today, Kerry.
Oh, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.